welcome all of you who are attending today's Soul Repair Center webinar, exploring the implications of COVID for the experience of moral injury for medical and spiritual caregivers in civilian, military, and VA hospitals. I'm Nancy Ramsey. I'm the director of the Soul Repair Center located at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth. We're delighted to offer these webinars with our co-sponsor, the Volunteers of America's Shea Moral Injury Center, directed by Rita Nakashima-Brock, a senior vice president at Volunteers of America. Our speakers today in order are Cesar Rentie, a vice president for Pastoral Services at Methodist Healthcare System in Dallas. Jonathan Fisher. Chaplain Fisher is a major in the U.S. Army and combat veteran. He directs the CPE program at Brook Medical Center in San Antonio and serves on the Army's Graduate School for Army Chaplain Corps Professional Development. Trey Barnett is a retired captain in the United States Air Force and a VA mental health chaplain in South Texas Veterans Healthcare System in San Antonio, Texas. I will serve as the moderator of our webinar, and I'm grateful to the Reverend Kyle Fauntleroy, a retired captain and chaplain in the U.S. Navy, who currently serves as Director of Development at Brite Divinity School, who will monitor our chat box. Please direct your questions to him. We will begin with each panelist making a presentation. Then I'll moderate a shared conversation among the three, and then we'll open the webinar for them to address questions you sent to Kyle for the panelists. We also hope that you'll take note of the next webinar, which is scheduled for the 2 p.m. on January 13th, addressing dementia care among older veterans, that will be led by Dr. Brock, Professor James Eller at Baylor University, and me. Now let's turn to our panelists and begin with Chaplain Cesar Rentie.
Thank you for the opportunity to share with you and to be here. Dr. Ramsey, it's a pleasure to be able to, an honor to be able to talk about the subject, particularly as it relates to where we are in healthcare. As I think about where we are and think about in terms of the number of people who have been infected by the virus, when you think worldwide, that we, as many people as we have worldwide who have been impacted by this virus, and then you narrow that down to what's happened in the United States with over 12 million people impacted by the virus and 250,000 folks who have died from this virus. It's not hard to imagine that this will be with us and the impact of the virus will be with us for a long time. And I think it's important for us to realize that those 12 million people who are here, who have 12 million plus who are here, who are infected, now have a pre-existing condition that will impact the health care system far into the future. I think also when you take into account that the most vulnerable of our society, folks from Black and Brown communities and working class folks have been impacted by this virus. I think it gives you a real sense of urgency, or just a real sense of understanding how deep this problem is and how it has changed how we will think about healthcare. I've been in the hospital and serving as a chaplain for 25 years. I've never seen anything like this. And I can say that it's, as I've watched it take a toll on my colleagues, I know that it has also taken a mental toll on me. As I think about the folks that we have cared for and the communities in which Methodist Health System serves and the people that come here, they align a lot like most of the folks who end up in the hospital. Working class, usually, 50,000 and under. The majority of folks who are on the COVID unit spend their daily life working hourly jobs, seeking income to do that. And so there's income that's tied to that. And then the access to healthcare is also tied to that as well, because a lot of times the insurance that they carry is tied to that. I found a study, and I thought it was interesting. Interesting part of the study is that 68% of folks who make an income of $50,000 or less will be reluctant to spend any out-of-pocket money for healthcare if it's going to impact their healthcare. So what ends up happening is you have a person who now waits longer before they come and encounter the hospital. So by the time they get to the hospital, they're sicker, and that means that there's more resources that have to be used to take care of them. I think that's the mental part or the physical part of what it is that we see in terms of just the care and the stress that it places on the system. I think the other part of it is the emotional and psychological toll that it takes on these communities, and also the broader community. I love Dr. Martin Luther King's words where he says, "We are caught in an inescapable web of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And I think it's important for us to know that here in South Dallas, if coronavirus is if it's raging, then it's going to impact our whole system and impact the whole city and our ability to be able to do all the other things to give care. As a chaplain working here and then working with the staff, what I have now begun to understand is that coronavirus is presented to me kind of a parallel experience as while it's nothing like being in war. It feels like a war zone, because every time someone comes to the emergency room, nurses and frontline staff have to assume that this person has COVID. In fact, every encounter that you have in the hospital, even in my own department, I have to assume that everyone has COVID. And so I have to behave a certain way. And it places me in a smaller box, which continues to place that stress on me. What I've seen with our staff is, and this falls in line with a lot of the studies that I've seen, is that there's lots of anxiety about COVID. There's lots of anxiety about COVID and the impact, not only to them as healthcare workers, but also what that means for their families. A lot of the frontline workers are moms and dads. They are sons and daughters. They have people that they take care of, and a lot of folks that work here in healthcare are faced with that. That's producing in and of itself post-traumatic stress, and we see that. The other thing is moral injury. And I was fortunate to connect with you, and we had this conversation about moral injury and how it is impacting our staff. The decisions that we have to make because of the virus, because of the limited resources that we have. And I think as those numbers continue to grow, they'll place more and more pressures on healthcare systems to have to now begin to ration what it is that you do. That will begin to produce moral injurious results for our medical staff. I see this, I hear this, and the way that I hear it with our staff is that, with one of our physicians who has 35 years in our emergency room, a leader in the DFW area in healthcare, one of the things that he said to me was, "It's a beating every day because I cannot connect with my patients the way that I want to. I wear a mask, all the subtle ways that I can show empathy and show care, I can't do that, and that makes me feel bad. I also have to make decisions that that I normally wouldn't have to make, because there are other things that I have to consider. I have to keep my own distance. I can't move in as closely as I want to when someone is in pain, and all of those things are really bothersome. The use of just the having to preserve resources and make sure that you have enough to do your job are all the things that produce lots of injury. And what I'm finding is that not only does that, and I think the studies bear itself out, but not only does it produce injury, but it is also producing a constant stress. And the stress comes from the feeling of the feeling of inadequacy. So on our COVID unit, when our doctors and our nurses are with our families or with the patients, they're spending time with the patient and they're caring for the patient. But when the family, when the patient, if the patient dies, then it is the nurse who offers the pastoral care to the family, because our chaplains can't get onto the COVID unit. It's usually closed to everyone. And what we're finding, and this was the call that I was on this morning with our staff, was that there's this feeling like I'm not doing enough. And that's producing its own stress. The other part is the feeling of ambiguous loss. And we talked about that work around ambiguous loss and how there's this deep need. How long will this last? We know that healthcare has changed. The way that we do things is different, but we're still here and we're still called on to care. And so we're dealing with that, and that loss is producing its own stress, because there's no clear understanding of what the future looks like. Will we get back what we lost? And none of us can say yes, we will. And I think that in and of itself is producing that constant stress. It plays itself out in folks' inability to sleep, depression, post-traumatic stress, all of those different ways. And so as a chaplain who has worked in the system, one of the things that I try to do is look at what are the resources we have, how can I support our staff and help meet those needs. And so looking at that, teaming with other people in the hospital and other disciplines to make a coherent team. The other thing is, while there is also this other part of the pandemic that's raging, there's a whole part of racism and all of that has impacted the healthcare. So because most of the people who are suffering are Black and brown people, and a lot of the people who are taking care of them, doctors and nurses, are Black and brown people. And when we see like the murder of George Floyd on TV, it produces additional stress already for a stressful situation that you're already in. And so as a chaplain, I'm often constantly thinking about what it is that we need to do and how we need to approach our staff and what type of care that we need to offer them as a department. And so teaming with wellness, teaming with our organizational effectiveness, and partnering, and what we did was create a group that's basically called the Methodist Health System Cares Group, that is designed to take all of these disciplines and work together in helping connect with our teams to help our departments not only help our staff connect to outside resources, but to connect to the resources inside. And what's interesting is that you may have someone who is inside and they have all of the things that they need from a jobs point of view, all the resources to be able to get counseling and all of that stuff. Their family might not have it. And this was a case for a grandmother whose daughter was depressed, and this was producing also stress for her. So the grandmother, who is a nurse, whose daughter is a student at a local high school, who was depressed about the COVID virus, and it was separating her, and she had no resources for her. So reaching out to the department and thinking about ways and how to support them. So when I think about it in totality, I think when I think of it as a system, I think COVID-19 itself has changed, and I think we have to acknowledge it's changed how we'll move forward in healthcare. I think we also have to take into account that we all are suffering and we're all in this together, and that there is a role for faith communities to play a part in the spiritual and emotional well-being of healthcare workers, but the community itself. I think that spiritual communities are particularly oriented towards dealing with several things. The first one is moral injury. It is a spiritual disruption in our life, and spiritual communities have the ability to really speak to that. And so speaking to that in a way that it's not clinical language, it's language that's based in our humanity and our connection to the divine. Ambiguous loss, I think, is the other thing that spiritual communities and communities of faith have the ability to speak to. And what I say to our department and what I say to wellness is that while there are certain things that you do, we have the ability to now begin to speak to the existential questions that this virus has presented, so that we can address what it is that we lost, and then find a way to grieve it and then to move forward. One of the things that I gathered from you is the whole thing about lament. Lamenting is important, and it's important because it identifies who we are as human beings. In fact, one of the most powerful things that I found is that when we allow our staff to lament, and it's not considered lament to them, they don't see it in that way, but as I see it as a chaplain, it becomes connected to their experience, where they are on the floor. God, do you really care? and so we get the opportunity to bear witness to that. And then I think the other thing is gratitude. Gratitude is also the thing that has a spiritual component, but the thing about gratitude is that it helps us not focus so much on the problem. I think we're all geared, and science bears itself out, that we're all focused or geared towards looking towards danger. And in the middle of a pandemic, that's all you're doing. But gratitude allows us the opportunity to change how our minds work. And so what we're trying to do is figure out ways to offer gratitude. This is exactly what the faith community is built for and positioned to do, and can take it and can really help in terms of healthcare and emotional and spiritual care and well-being for our coworkers.
Thank you, Caesar. Thank you very much. There'll be more to share, I know, when the three of you have a chance to talk, but I appreciate your presentation. So, Chaplain Fisher.
Yes, ma'am. Right here. I'm Jonathan Fisher, and just I'll offer some context of who I am and where I'm coming from. So I'm an active duty Army chaplain, and I'm a ACPE certified educator, and I direct the CPE program at Brook Army Medical Center here in San Antonio. So what I'm going to refer to are some intentional conversations I had with our staff chaplains, as well as leadership and our chaplain residents, as well as they've working with this idea and what it's been like for them. So I don't have a lot of direct patient contact myself. I supervise those who are doing that work. So in the time of COVID, we've gone, back in March, I had a group that we went from being in person every single day to being online, doing our group work online. And then I've now brought in another resident group that is in that process as well. One of the things that has come up over and over again connects to something you said, Caesar, and that is, I think you said it's a beating every day. I think that's the language I heard you use. And the language that was used in the conversations I had is a grind, that it feels like a meat grinder. when I reflected on this idea of moral injury and how this is showing up, there are the back then stories that are being tapped by this experience in the here and now. And then there's the stuff that's happening in the here and now. So the back then stuff, and I resonate with this because it's my stuff as well. So I've had 3 combat tours in Iraq under 3 different campaigns. And we choose to do this work, right? Army chaplains feel a sense of vocation, a sense of call. We come into this work. And sometimes the choices that we make hurt the people we love. So in this way, my kids, have, I think my oldest daughter is in her 8th or 9th school that she's gone through over time. And that's her life. She's used to it. She knows it. And I'm aware of what my choices have cost her. And that has that sense of separation and the betrayal that I feel personally about being away from my family is heightened and tapped when we're working long shifts at the hospital and we're separated from others. And the choices that we make that put us in a level 1 trauma center in the midst of a COVID pandemic now impacts the way we interact with our families. In so many ways, they once again are called upon to pay the price for the work we are called to do. And the chaplains I spoke with talked about how overwhelming that is. Because not only are they separated, having to make choices, because they're chaplains who are, have family members who might be immunocompromised or in other ways be put at risk. And now we're bringing it, whatever we got, we're bringing back home to them. Deployments for us have always been something that takes place somewhere else. But in this context, our families are put at risk. So that's kind of the conscientious conundrum that comes up. Do I interact with this person and put my family at risk and just let them die alone? There's another aspect of this, which is centered in the values, the moral values, and the training that we have as Army chaplains. So in our training, I speak collectively here, but in our training, one of our core values, we have 3 really. They are honor the dead, nurture the living, and care for the wounded. And what that looks like in the U.S. Army context is we have a phrase we use: we move to the sound of the guns. So wherever the suffering is the worst, wherever the dead are, wherever the dying are, if that's a forward aid station just off the front line, or if that's, wherever that tends to be, that is where the chaplain belongs. And when COVID hit, chaplains were put in a position of not being able to do the thing that they are called to do. And that violates a core value. One of the chaplains said to me, "Who am I if I'm not the person who goes to the suffering? Who am I if I don't sit by someone's bed while they die and hold their hand?" Early on, when we didn't have a lot of clarity about how to interact with this pandemic, patient contact, went down to very minimal. A nurse might go in there. And since then, as we've become more aware and we've trusted our PPE more, our personal protective equipment, now our chaplains are able to go and interact. But it's still a choice that's made in dire, extreme circumstances. In other words, a person is going to die. Then we will send them in. And then the chaplain is, it is the blessing and curse of this work. Because at one point, on one hand, we're able to stand in the gap and be the go-between between a grieving family who sent their 30-year-old husband who just feel like he couldn't catch his breath at the hospital, and a month later the chaplain goes in to pray with him because he is going to die immediately. He'll never go home, with no other pre-existing conditions, that type of thing. And the chaplain stands in that gap, and that is a huge burden that the chaplain has. They carry their own grief and anxiety, and they are shouldering in that moment the grief and anxiety of that family. and that anger and frustration. And then of course there's the patient themselves who are dying. We live and breathe and work in the world of emotions and in the world of grief, death, and dying. This is the work we do. And what COVID has done is taken that normative experience and heightened it by limiting the ability to do the thing that we're asked to do and that we feel called to do. In the conversations I had, I noticed there's some shame that shows up. The shame centers around, if a person is exposed, they got to get out of the hospital and be home for a couple of weeks. But then if they do that, it's a level 1 trauma center. Somebody else has to carry the weight. And as a soldier, that again is a value that we have, that I pull my weight. Nobody else pulls my weight. But now I can't do that. And I have to watch from a distance while somebody else does my job. There's some guilt about how they might be carrying something that will impact their family members or others in their community. I know chaplains who separated themselves from their family intentionally so that they could provide care at the hospital, right? There's a sense of betrayal that they were called to do something and they are restricted from doing it. Somebody is telling them no, or they have to make that decision, which becomes a burden of conscience. And there's a sense of helplessness. How do I provide for this person who is dying and there's nothing I can really do? I'll offer you an anecdote of one chaplain who was getting close to retirement. And as he was coming up toward his retirement, COVID kicks off, and his daughter, who had spent her entire life as a child of a military chaplain on active duty, who had missed birthdays and anniversaries and Christmases and all these things, was going to get married. And because when COVID kicked off, we were restricted. We had restricted movement. We couldn't really go outside about 100 miles of the city. And so now he couldn't go to his daughter's wedding. So now he's carrying with him all of the guilt and the shame and the burden of, once again, my decision to follow my calling is preventing me from experiencing this one thing that my daughter wants. And I relay that story to say that story repeats itself over and over and over again. So as chaplains are being with people, walking alongside of them in their grief, they also are carrying the responsibility and burden of all of their own. This idea of spiritual stress really came home just recently when the numbers started spiking again. So this is where it moved from a back then to the here and now. And I in my second deployment, I relieved a chaplain downrange who had some issues and had to return to the States. And it was during what was called the surge. I don't know if any of you remember this back in the day. Happened in 2007, 2008. It was when the surge took place in Iraq, and then they extended. So my unit was one of the units. And I'll never forget that my boss came in and said, "Hey, Chap, we got to go talk to the soldiers." And then told the soldiers, I know you thought you were going home in a month and a half, 2 months, but you're going to have to stay longer. And that sense of deflation, like, dear God, I can't do this for another 3 months. And the sense of fear. Oh, what if I die? I've survived 11 months. I don't want to die here in the last few months. That sense of has come back as the numbers have spiked. We survived the initial onslaught. We survived the summer surge. And now here we are at the end of it all. And the numbers are going back up. And we got to constrain our lives even more. And then, and people clap their hands and they say, well done, good for you. And the other side of that is that they won't protect themselves and they show up. And that's that anger, that deflation, that grind is fairly numbing to some. So those are some of the ideas that were shared with me by chaplains who are working with it. And my hope is that I could put it in context of what you're experiencing. Does that get after it, Nancy? You're on mute, by the way.
Yes, thank you very much. And we'll look forward to the collaborative conversation in a moment. Thank you. And now, Chaplain Barnett.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Ramsey. And it's such a wonderful opportunity to be here with Reverend Rentie and Chaplain Fisher to talk about this important issue of moral injury and COVID-19. I have some slides. I don't know if they're up right now. There we go. Slides help keep me on track, make sure I'm going in the right direction because I might go off somewhere. But I'm Chaplain Tracy Barnett. I am the mental health chaplain here at the VA. Chaplain Fisher was talking about working with active duty chaplains. I get the honor and the privilege to work with those veterans after they have left active duty. They come to the VA Center for care and treatment, and I get to see a lot of them. Next slide, please. As we were talking about moral injury, I thought it was important because I know this audience consists of a lot of clergy, chaplains that may or may not be familiar with moral injury. Here's a working definition of moral injury. There is not a consensus of moral injury, but this is a working definition for us. It's harm caused by perpetrating, failing to prevent, witnessing, learning about actions that violate deeply held moral beliefs or expectations. It's what I go into combat with. What are my values? Next slide, please. Things that we were raised with. And I go into combat and I betray those values, or there's a sense of betrayal of what is right, what is wrong. We were all raised in certain homes. We were raised to respect certain things. And we may go to combat. We may go to the war zone and find that we have violated our moral, religious upbringing. And sometimes even the military standards, those deeply held beliefs, those things that we believe in, those get violated. Next slide, please. And so moral injury sometimes can be considered in the eye of the beholder. Moral transgressions, it's subjective. It's my morals I have violated, or the morals of a veteran that he has violated. Just recently talking to a veteran who sees himself as being evil because he was in a war zone doing his job and a young person was killed. And so now he's home and he's having a difficult time connecting with his own children because he feels evil because a life of a child was taken over there, and he doesn't feel right having to being able to enjoy his own children. So he finds himself isolated away from his children because, as he said to me, I don't want this evil to get on them, as if it's contagious. So based on the values of the veteran, their standard, their expectation, their interpretation, he went to combat wanting to protect people, wanted to protect children, and he violated that by taking the lives of a child. Next slide, please. It kind of looks like this. Here's a model of what moral injury may look like. Acts that violate moral values. The situation I just described, it puts them in this dilemma. Who am I now? And maybe it causes an injury. We might even call it a soul wound. It wounds us. And I would tell, just like I tell the people in some of my groups, if we don't treat a wound, physical wound, if we leave it, sometimes that wound gets infected. And though it started in my right arm, now that injury, I can feel it in my right foot because it's gotten into my system. And now the infection has gone to my right foot. When we have a soul wound, maybe it started maybe in our childhood, or maybe it started on the battlefield. If left untreated, it gets infected. And so we come home, and now the thing that bothered us in the war zone is now showing up at home in our relationships or on the job with angry outbursts. We have become infected, and now we must treat that infection. Next slide, please. And so there are some sources where these things come from. It could be an act of betrayal by our leaders. They didn't do the right thing. They put us in harm's way, or maybe it was out of proportion violence from others. Or maybe we were first responders, med techs, and we were trained to save lives and we couldn't prevent the death and suffering of others. And so now we're carrying that burden of not being able to save a life, as if we could save every life that came before us. And sometimes that's a moral injury. And I think maybe the cross section, what Reverend Rentie was talking about, those first responders, those workers in the hospitals, not being able to save anybody. And sometimes that's a moral injury that a person could carry. It's perceived errors or mistakes. And so it is something that we carry. It's a burden on our soul. Next slide, please. I like this slide because it helps me to really flesh out and visualize what a moral injury would looks like. If you look at the slide, it's really two circles going in, intersecting with one another. But if you look at the top section, it looks like a heart. And for me, a moral injury is a heart issue. And there is a difference between PTSD and moral injury. PTSD is often diagnosed here. Moral injury doesn't have a diagnosis, but they cross over one another. PTSD, there's isolation due to hypervigilance. We're always on alert because that's kind of what we learned to do when we were on the battlefield, to always be alert. And so we isolate ourselves because maybe we don't feel safe. Well, moral injury has some of the same symptoms, but they come from different places and have different meanings. Maybe for moral injury, we avoid out of loss of hope. I just don't see it getting any better. And so I want to avoid even getting myself into the situation. PTSD, I'm going to avoid because out of a concern for safety. There's someone after me. I can't go to the mall. I'm going to avoid the mall because around the corner, someone's going to come out and attack me. And so we're going to avoid that situation. Moral injury, I'm going to isolate due to feelings of unworthiness. The veteran I just talked about who feels that he's evil because he's done something evil is isolating himself from his children because he wants to protect them. I don't feel worthy enough to be around them. And so he's saying, I love you, stay away from me. And the family is saying, I love you, come close. And so there are two opposite messages going on and they're not communicating. And then that avoidance, that isolation causes families to become fractured and frayed. Next slide, please. And so we don't often notice these things for veterans until they come home. They're removed from the war context because when we're in battle, we don't have time to think about these things. We don't have time to think about my friend that just died next to me. As one veteran said to me, he was evaporated right next to me. And so he has to continue on with the mission. He's got to continue fighting. There's no time to grieve. There's no time to really analyze what has gone on. And so some of these things don't show up until we've come home. We're in a safe place. We're removed from the war context. But we don't have a buddy to talk with. The unit's not there anymore. Friends and family cannot understand. They won't understand some of the things we've done. And now we're alone and we're analyzing some of the things we've done, and it doesn't even make sense to ourselves. And so this wound, untreated, is starting to spread. Next slide, please. And so there's a multidimensional way of repairing ourselves. And we try to do this here at South Texas. We're working collaboratively with other disciplines. One of our outpatient clinics here at South Texas, we have 14 outpatient clinics around the city. One outpatient clinic is dedicated to post-traumatic, is designated the post-traumatic clinical team, where they work with those with PTSD. In that clinic, there's psychiatrists, psychologists, licensed social workers, peer support, and they help identify and treat, and then they refer a lot of those veterans to the chaplain because they're starting to realize maybe it is PTSD, but it also might be a moral injury, which the chaplain is able to speak to. And we work with our high risk committee who identifies those individuals throughout our system who may be in distress and at risk for suicide. And so they'll refer them to the chaplain, and we'll make calls. We'll be there trying to speak to their issues. Next slide, please. And so there is this spiritual component that we try to speak to, trying to restore a sense of worthiness, trying to make meaning out of the things we've gone through, purpose, and identify hope. Next slide. So how has the pandemic impacted us here? How has it impacted the veteran? That's the question we've been trying to answer. Anecdotally, we've seen an increase from my perspective as a chaplain, as the mental health chaplain. There's increase in the programs and support, veteran support for spiritual support. A lot of questions. Can we speak to the chaplain? We've got increased referrals from that team I was just talking to you about, the PCT. Those referrals are coming in and consults are coming in. So many, it's almost greater than we can answer. Here it is, group attendance has doubled. We've got waiting lists for most of our groups now. Some of the groups that we teach are moral injury, PTSD, spirituality. We're using a resource called Reboot, which is a Christian-oriented answer to combat recovery. And so all of these factors put together, there's been no deep dive study on how they're responding, but most of it is saying to us that there is our veterans who have moral injury or PTSD are having a difficult time coping with COVID, and the inability to kind of distract themselves from their intrusive, debilitating thoughts. When we were outside of COVID, they could distract themselves by going to the VFW or going to the mall and not having to think about some of the things that have gone on in their lives. And so that's kind of the anecdotal information, but I put it out to some of our veterans to see how they were doing. Next slide. And here's what they said. Art, a 32-year-old OEF Army vet, he says, I felt like I was in combat without a weapon. So it's disorienting, it's fear. Can you imagine being in combat and you don't have a weapon? You feel vulnerable. He said, I was avoiding to the point where I wrapped a rope around from the flagpole around my neck. This is his experience. There were angry outbursts as his father. But here's what I like about Art. During the pandemic, because he couldn't avoid his circumstance, he said this, I am now leaning into my trauma and looking for outlets to keep myself productive, looking for meaningful work during this crisis. And so working with him, speaking to his spiritual part, he is now leaning in instead of trying to avoid some of the things that he's going through. Avoidance hasn't worked, and we figured that part out. So why not lean into it? Next slide, please. Here's Bill. Bill is a Vietnam veteran. He's 67 years old. Here's what he said. I should have stuck to my guns. He's still ruminating over something that happened 40 years ago. So Bill was in charge. He's in Navy. I know we got some Navy guys here. He was in charge. There was a storm. He was ordered not to let anyone out of the ship. He got overruled by his supervisor. And someone else saying, the captain said, it's okay for this guy to go out. He let him go out. 2 hours later, the guy was dead. He says, but now all I do is sit in my chair. I can't go anywhere. I can't go shopping. I can't go to church. And so now the thing I had not been thinking about for 40 years is now showing up. I can't avoid it. I used to have nightmares, but now I have daymares. I'm wide awake and I see this young man I haven't thought about in 40 years. If I had just stuck to my guns, he says, he would still be alive. So he's dealing with guilt. He's dealing with shame. Maybe we can talk with him as we go further in our discussion with him about the thought of forgiveness. He says, I can't distract myself anymore. So I'm thinking about this stuff all the time. COVID has isolated him and made him focus on his own thoughts. Next slide, please. Here's a Gulf War veteran. And he says, I believe my symptoms have grown exponentially over the past year. Having more dreams that center around being helpless, the absence of distraction. He says the same thing. And so he's using a lot of the techniques that he's learning here at the VA to try to distract and hope and focus on being thankful. Next slide, please. I know and so why am I telling you all this? Because I know there's some local clergy that are in with us on this this call. And these are the people that are showing up in your churches. These are the people that are showing up, in your neighborhood. And as a clergy, you are the specialists in dealing with some of this guilt and shame and forgiveness. You know how to talk, as Rentie said, the language of restoration. We have rituals that might be able to deal with this. And we represent the divine. And sometimes there's less stigma than going to a mental health provider. They'll come to their clergy, they'll come to their pastor because they trust you, or they'll come to the chaplain to sit down and talk. Next slide, please. And so here's some qualities that the chaplains have that we ought to embody all the time. Learning how to be non-judgmental. We're a non-anxious presence. As Chaplain Fisher is teaching those chaplains over there how to do all these things, how to be non-judgmental, how to be a non-anxious presence, learning how to be transparent when appropriately, and learning how to engage a person where they are, walking with them through their dark times and walking with them through their darkness. Next slide, please. And so some of the ideas for engaging them, and I think this might be my last slide, I think, is just having this active listening, trying to normalize some of these feelings as they're coming home. It ought to impact us. Taking a life is not normal. It takes something from us. And so we ought to mourn. We ought to learn how to mourn. We ought to learn how to grieve. We ought to learn how to forgive. And some of the toughest conversations that I have is around this idea of forgiveness. And sometimes they have no problem forgiving other people. The biggest problem they have is learning how to forgive themselves. And so we learn how to walk through some of those things. As a local pastor, you help it reintegrate them into the community. And so how can they serve? How can they contribute to your church, to the community? And so that's some of the things that we do as chaplains, helping them to make meaning, helping them to find purpose, and helping them find hope and reconnecting them to their community. Next slide. That's it. And so I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite all three panelists to unmute. That's great, if you will. Thank you. Guys, that was terrific. I really appreciate it. And before we turn to, there's a lot of continuity in themes in the questions in the chat. And I'm figuring some of that has also occurred to each of you as you've listened to one another. So I want to provide you with an opportunity, maybe in the next 15 minutes, to engage each other. Things that came to mind, ideas that you can share. So really good response to your comments, and I look forward to your conversation.
I would ask both of my panelists. I know Rentie, you mentioned your service to the staff there. I wonder if you had any rituals that would help the staff to recover, walk through them. And maybe Chaplain Fisher, how are the chaplains there taking care of themselves? And if you have any rituals for your chaplains.
Yeah, rituals have been important to what we have done here and to deal with COVID and to deal with our feelings. We have a ritual called Blessings of the Hands that we've done, every year in Nurses Week, and this was an opportunity for us to not only form community but to talk about our vulnerabilities. In this Blessing of the Hands, we had a mat that was printed with two hands on it, and it had a prayer in the middle, and our staff would place their hands on the hands that were printed there. And what the feedback that I received was that the ability to come together, to take the moment to pray, to talk specifically about the limits of our hands and what they can and cannot do, was really meaningful to our staff. And it was, and that allowed for more opportunities to then be able to talk about their experience. That's one thing that we've done. And then when George Floyd died, when George Floyd was murdered, and our community was disrupted with all of the protests and all of the things that were happening, we weren't outside of that. That was happening also with our staff. There were people that wanted us to say something about it, and so what we ended up doing as a hospital was taking a moment to go outside and to breathe. And so on all of our campuses, our doctors, our administrators, our nurses, all of them went outside, and for the time that George Floyd, that it took for him to die, we kneeled. And then at the end of it, I just sung on an old song, "We Shall Overcome," one day, and we did that as a group, and it was offered for the whole community, and it's those types of rituals that allow us to be able to talk about that. And that was a healing part for a lot of the Black and brown doctors who emailed and talked about needing to have voice to that. The other thing was, speaking clearly, to the administration, that there had to be something said about what happened. And I think in that, it also allowed that time for healing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like that, Cesar. I think from where I sit, it seems like the rest of the world has slowed down, right, to a crawl.
Mm-hmm.
But for those who are actively engaged in this, it has only sped up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's that sense of disconnect is real. I think a thing that pastors and faith leaders could do is to reach out, right? So there's a lot of energy around, well, if they'll just ask for what they need, if they'll just reach out to me, and we'll take good care of them. If you have someone in your congregation or your synagogue or your group that you're a part of, they need you to reach out to them, check in with them, just see if they're okay. That's so important. What we've done here is, in the various groups that I've had, is pay attention to it. So there's a sense of, it's almost like and I'm speaking here for, there's probably some retired chaplains. I saw Glenn Palmer out there. Good to see you. When we're in a deployment mode, it's a go time, right? It's 24/7. There's no slack. I will sleep when this is all over. And one of the things that I have done as a person in that space who's outside of it is provide ways for various pockets of chaplains to slow down and to recognize the impact that this is having. There's the immediate impact when people die, and there's just how that grind impacts over time. So I provide a space to breathe, be present, become aware, of what you're experiencing. And then sometimes when I'm done with that, and I'd offer this to everyone out there, I find it's very helpful to just reflect back to the person what I heard them say. I just reflect it. I say, so sounds like this, and this. And somehow when I say it, oh, then it's like, oh yeah, it's been really hard. You know, I was fine until I heard that all of those things put together. So that's a thing that I'm offering in the context of the groups I'm involved in.
You know,
Right, does that get to the question that you'd raised? Trey?
Sorry,
I said, is there
I'm sorry.
is there any follow-up to what you'd asked, or I'm going to move to the others? All right.
You can move to the others. I'm sorry.
Lisa or Jonathan, are there points you'd like to, invite further discussion about?
You know, Trey talked about normalization, and I think it's really important to talk because you know, I've played football on all levels. So played pro ball, played college ball at the University of Oklahoma. For any Texas fans, I'm praying for you. And then, you know, high school ball. One of the things you learn as an athlete is you learn early, if you have any measure of success, is you have to play with pain. You also know that in healthcare, to be effective, there are a lot of things that you just can't hold tightly to, but you have to. There's not this opportunity to be vulnerable. Although we're all nervous, I mean, we all feel this nervous tension and fear, but there's no room to speak about it. And what I find in healthcare, and I'm sure it's probably the same thing that you find in organizations that perform at a high level, is this place to normalize vulnerability, to be able to speak to it. And what I've tried to do is, and that was one of the reasons why I really try to connect with multidisciplinary teams, to not only model for them, but to also invite people to be vulnerable, to speak to the CEO and to say, it's okay for you to be vulnerable at this time, and to invite moments to be vulnerable so that everyone else will know that it's okay for me to feel this way. If I'm angry, and if I, you know, I mean, if I feel angry about the position that I'm in, I'm not being disloyal to the institution. I'm angry because this is not what I hope for, what I want to be. And I think naming that is really important. And I was just thinking about Trey's presentation and how important it is to be able to speak to that, and the roles that we can play as spiritual caregivers to speak to that, to really speak to the medical. And when I think of doctors and this institution, it's really driven by data. I mean, it's outcomes and data and all of that stuff. And then you know, you look at chaplaincy and the spiritual stuff, and there's not an appreciation, but the fact of the matter is that 95% of us believe in the divine. That's a super majority that when faced with problems, we're asking existential questions. 84% of our patients that we encounter make healthcare decisions based on their relationship with God or a moral disruption in their life. And you can say all day that your sugar levels are not right, or that this is not right, or that wearing a mask or not wearing a mask or whatever it is. You can talk about that all day until you get to the existential question of our connection as a community, our connection to the divine. What does this mean to me? And normalize that. I think it's important. I think that's that. I mean, you know, when I think about the race issue, it's the same thing. We can have policies all day and never impact it until we finally get to the point where we can talk about what does this mean for me. And You know, like I said COVID, and I know this is a whole nother subject, but I said COVID made us all Black because we had to wear a mask. We had to behave a certain way. You know, you're suspicious of everybody that comes in the room. You're always living at a heightened state. And that's the Black experience. And what I'm saying, when I say to my white colleagues and white administrators, welcome to the Black world. And what COVID has told us about what it feels like to be vulnerable and to own that and to name it and to bring us connection together in community.
Thank you, Caesar.
I really like what you're saying, Caesar. It strikes me that naming it is powerful.
Yeah.
Just naming it. I think about, a dynamic that I have noticed, I think it's probably pretty prevalent across the chaplaincy world anyway, but it seems to really show up in these last year, is the extraordinary ability that I have noticed chaplains having to dismiss the pain that they're in.
Right.
Just no, and the way they dismiss it generally kind of revolves around, they know how hard it is for somebody else. No matter how hard my day is, you know, that ICU nurse is pulling her third 12-hour shift in a week, and I know that it is sucking the life out of her. So however hard it is for me, it's always harder for them. And I think what I've noticed in the groups I've been around is naming all of the stressors that are coming in, naming them, owning them, being gentle with oneself, and saying, this sucks. This is a hard time. This is not easy. Yeah, you're right. This is life-changing.
You know, I think probably one of the most powerful things for me was this year, after going as hard as I was, and you know, I called Dr. Ramsey, and we were talking, and you know, and this was at the height of the sheltering in place and watching all of this, and we're working through this. And then I lost my brother-in-law, and then I lost my mother-in-law, both same year. And then I have a Jack Russell Terrier that I've had for 20 years, and he died. And I realized that I needed to stop. And one of the things that I did was went to the person that I report to, and I said, I need to take a break, and I need to take about a month. and that's what I did. And what's interesting is that I was having this inner dialogue with myself, right? I mean, because I already know that to succeed, you have to play with pain.
Yeah.
But I'm having to say to myself, man, I need this. I need to take this time because I'm not all right. I'm not all right. And I need to be vulnerable enough to share that not only with my boss, but also with my colleagues, and express that to them, that I'm not all right, that I still grieve.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
I really appreciate that. There's some questions that others have raised that I want to bring for you all to discuss. And just as an informational question, someone wanted to ask, I missed this, that 84% of the people making healthcare decisions, did somebody use the percentage 84%?
Yeah, I did.
Could you clarify that?
Well, it was a study done by Johns Hopkins, and what they found was that 84% of patients value spiritual care just as important as physical care, and they want the healthcare provider to speak to that. That it is really important for that to happen. Now, it's funny because I say this to our administrators, and I hope that there are administrators on here. But here in Dallas, and in the DFW area, and if you live in Texas, there are two things that are big business. It's football and church. I mean, or faith communities. And one of the things that, and I don't say it in, I'm not saying it in a derogatory sense, but I'm saying it in a way that as I look at it, the scripture says where our heart is, that where our treasure is also. In South Dallas, off 67 and 20, intersection of 67 and 20, Charlton Methodist Health System sits right at that corner. In that vicinity, there's Friendship West Baptist Church, there's Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, which is Tony Evans, Dr. Evans's church. Friendship West Baptist Church is Dr. Freddie Haynes's church. There is Concord Baptist Church, and then there's IBOC. And those churches alone, just in property value, is over $1 million. I mean, over $100 million. So I think what you, I mean, and I really believe I'm being conservative, because just one of those campuses is a $25 million campus. And so when you look at that in the midst of COVID, in the midst of the Black community, what you really begin to understand, what I said we had to understand, is that spirituality is important, and faith communities can play a role in connecting with the heart and the spirit of people. The good thing is that chaplaincy and the work that we do in the hospital and the training that we get equips us to live in both worlds, to be amphibious, and I guess to live both on land and in water, but to be able to take the clinical piece and then be able to speak about what does this mean to us, and what does God have to say about it. And that's where that's why I think it's important for us to be able to speak to that. I think now more than ever, it is our role. I refuse to shrink back. It is now stepping up, because I know that COVID is producing those questions. When we're under threat, you know, when you're under threat, I mean, that is always a concern. You know, what does God have to do with me?
I think part of what the feedback from folks is, you're speaking, each of you has in one way or another spoken to the importance of self-care.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming that each of you in your respective responsibilities are able to encourage that for those who report to you. And you've talked a bit about sometimes you just have to take a break.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about being mindful of what you can control and what you can't. But I wonder if Jared, very briefly, if you could name, you know, no more than 3, you know, what are the highest or most valuable practices that you've found help you care for yourself?
Mm.
And that perhaps those that you care for, that you've recommended it and they found it helpful. Just, you know, the first 3 that come to mind.
Practicing gratitude.
Practicing gratitude. What does that look like in the midst of COVID?
It's taking the time every day to be mindful of something to be grateful for. And it's not that I'm not paying attention to all the things that are around me, but it's taking the time to be grateful for my colleagues, to be grateful to know that I'm not in this alone, that I have people who are journeying with me, to be grateful to know that I don't have to have all the answers. That's, to me, is practicing gratitude, and it allows me to focus and understand my place on the planet, that I'm not completely lost, but that I'm connected to a community. So gratitude.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, he jumped in on mine. But practicing gratitude, I think, is a great tool for all of us to remind ourselves of the breath and spirit that is within us, and to remind us that it could be worse, but I've got some things here that keep me upright. And what am I grateful for? My family's still here. And then to practice some of the things that we tell people to do. You know, sometimes it's difficult to walk with people through some of their darkness. It's a heaviness that you might have. But when I get out of here, I've got to remember, and I love what Caesar said earlier about the blessings of the hands. It reminds us what our hands cannot do. Some things we got to leave in God's hands. And so we put it there, and I go home. My wife and I, we bought bikes during the pandemic because you know, we couldn't go to the gym like we used to. And so now we're enjoying riding bikes and discovering some of the trails of San Antonio, looking at the beauty of nature of what God has created. And you know, there are so many deer that come onto the to the pathway and the walkway. I mean, they come right up to you. They're not afraid of you. And so enjoying some of that. And for me, it's pulling away and refreshing myself with God's word.
You know, I know just for a moment that another thing that Caesar Rentie and I have talked about earlier in the year was the way he instituted devotionals that often included nature scenes and really encouraged the staff, especially including those in the highest stress places like the ER nurses, to take 5 minutes, you know, and sort of disconnect. And this included music. It might or might not be religiously shaped music, but it kind of like what you were describing, Trey. Jonathan.
So I'd like the whole group, everybody, to just take a deep breath. I'm aware that we have just been pouring out information. And when I look at this comment slide, there's a lot of stuff going on. Reflect on, what is your rhythm of work? And what is your rhythm of rest? Because if these two rhythms aren't in sync, then we get that, what's the AFib, where our rhythms aren't in sync in our body, right? How do you get those rhythms in sync? I don't know how you do it. I know how I do it. But I think what often is, I know in my own self, I don't pay attention to the rhythm of work when it's hard and fast and when it's slow and easy. And I don't put my home rest cycle in sync with my work cycle. And that's what I would encourage you to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to get to a couple of the questions in the last 15 minutes that we have, almost 15. Because some persons have, I'm encouraged by the number of persons that have asked questions about religious leaders connecting with veterans or reservists, I assume, active duty persons in the congregations they serve. And I want to stress that that might be a Jewish synagogue, that might be a mosque, and the kind of ritual care that you've been mentioning could include rituals from those traditions or other creative rituals. But what advice do you give for religious leaders in whatever tradition for reaching out to veterans, reservists, active duty, mindful that the kinds of concerns that you all have mentioned for isolation can affect the 8 million veterans from Vietnam, World War II, Korea, World War, as well as the million plus from these more current wars. So what would you say to religious leaders regarding persons in their congregations?
I would say to religious leaders and for persons in their congregation is to know and to take note that they are there. That just by the very fact that the numbers are there, they are there. And I think if you have that orientation, and you, even if you're in a small congregation and you have no one serving, I think it's important to note that they are there. They may not come to your church, they may not come to your synagogue, but they are there and they are in the community, just like they're here in my hospital, just like they are here in my department. They're here. And I think if I just begin with that understanding that just by the very number that they're here, then what I'm going to do is then put the things in place to be able to speak to those,
Right.
to that community.
How about the others of you?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was reading some of the chat
Mm.
and I thought Deborah Abrams had an interesting question about faith and maybe she heard something, our language may have been Christian. And she asked, well, what about everyone else who may not be a Christian?
Right.
I would say number one, and John may be able to answer this even better, but in our training, we are trained to, as chaplains, to reach out to everyone, regardless of faith. Here's what I have discovered over my time as a chaplain: pain and hurt don't discriminate. And so it doesn't matter your background, your faith. If I can walk alongside you and give you purpose and maybe give you some hope, or just be there as you talk about some of the pain, I think that helps. As far as those individuals who are coming back, and trying to reintegrate into society, trying to find a job, trying to find out who they are, I think some of the things we talked about as those qualities for chaplains: being non-judgmental, not trying to fix it right now. I'm just trying to be with you. I don't want this to be an anxious moment in your life. I just want to, as chaplains, walk into those dark places and be comfortable in the dark, and realize your hope is that way. Let's just keep walking. And sooner or later, we're going to get out of here. But you have a compassionate person that's walking alongside you. I'm not going to leave you here.
Right.
I'm going to walk with you. And so I think those things are universal. Being able to actively listen to a person, being able to kind of normalize, yeah, you should feel, this does hurt.
Yeah.
And so some of those things are universal. They're not Christian centered or anything like that. And most of the groups that I have, there are a plethora of people from all different backgrounds. And so I wanted to say that.
And this can happen over the phone. It can happen with an iPad. It can happen with a Zoom call.
Exactly.
It can be in a Zoom group. It can be individual. But
all of my groups right now are virtual.
I understand, but I'm talking now about religious leaders.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Jonathan.
I want to say that from my perspective, non-anxious presence does not mean not anxious. It means I'm aware of my anxiety and I can work with it and I can work with others. I think that's it. That's what I want to say there. I think for me, and I'm speaking for myself. All right. So this is Jonathan Fisher, a 16-year Army veteran. I have been to so many churches and so many religious and non-religious organizations that call themselves welcoming, and they call themselves, we're just a family here. And then I'm the outsider and I can never get in the family. It's so hard because you have people have their language, they've got their traditions, whatever those things are. And I say that to say that one of the things I've experienced as an active duty service member, as well as everything else, and what I've experienced from my interactions with the veteran community, is they need you to reach out to them. They need you to come and find them, because they're not gonna. they don't even know how to anymore. They left a community 30 years ago to go serve in the military, and they came back to a community that's completely different. There's nothing about it that's the same for them.
Right.
Right. And so, and often churches, God bless them, they just don't know. They don't have any awareness around how they're exclusionary. But I would say, for you, controlling the world you can control in, how do you go out and find somebody and invite them? And if you're going to have your Netflix watch party, why don't you call that nurse that you know and see if they want to come be a part of it? And if you're going to have this, you're going to do an online euchre. I don't know if they play that. They play it in Michigan, where I'm from. You're going to play some euchre together. Then invite that person that, boy, they just kind of exist on the fringes. They're on the outside. Go find them. And what is the Christian New Testament talks about compelling them to come in. Go find them and bring them to.
I was aware, I'm aware of an interfaith veterans group in Delaware, where there are persons that had been visiting veterans in hospice care, and now they can't get in there, but a nurse holds the iPad screen so that this veteran continues to be connected with a veteran, who had been visiting him in person. So he's not forgotten. And I think that, in my experience, what I've heard is that the best person for communicating with another veteran is if religious leaders can find other veterans in the congregation, can they help link them? Not to absent the religious leader, but being mindful that the quality of the conversation and the candor of the conversation is enhanced between veterans, from what I've been able to read. I know we're coming now within about 5 minutes. I want to assure everybody that within about a week, the link for this will be on our website and at the VOA YouTube site. And I also want to remind folks that at this same site, the Soul Repair Center site, where you've linked onto this, you'll find a lot of resources that are quite pertinent for the kinds of care that these chaplains have been referencing, including the most recent book that we've sponsored called Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care, which is interreligious in its design and includes a number of both creative and familiar and ancient rituals. But there are other resources there that I think would be very helpful to you. And one of the things that I wondered about is the ways in which what you all are describing relate to grief. And, one of the sort of senior folks in pastoral care in the United States talks about the complexity of grief from men, that we do not engender boys in this culture readily to name the emotion of grief or to feel safe expressing it. And I wonder if your experience in care would resonate with that part of that grief is one of the themes or windows for responding to veterans and service persons in this context of COVID.
Yes, I think grief is a huge issue in my context here at the VA. What has happened is they've turned off their emotions. They don't want to feel, because if I feel, it's painful. So they've turned off their emotions. And the bad thing about turning off our emotion is we not only turn off the bad, we turn off the good. And so we can't express our joy, we can't express happiness, we can't connect with our family. And so in order to connect with our family, we need to begin to start feeling. Right. And some of that, I taught a lesson for one of our PTSD spiritual groups entitled, "It's Okay to Cry." One gentleman said, I can't cry. I try to cry. My mother died, my son died, and I've never cried because I haven't cried since 1974, Vietnam veteran. And then one day we were talking about stories, about spirituality. He said, well, I don't go to church. I said, what's special to you that you, it might be spiritual, but no one else would connect it. And he began to tell a story about, I build model airplanes and then I smash them. I said, wow, tell me about why you smashed them. What is that about? And he told me that he made a promise to one of his soldiers in Vietnam who died about building a model airplane. That's what he was into. And then as he was telling me this story, tears began to fall out of his eyes. He was connecting back to the grief, a grief that he had not expressed in 40 years. Even when his children had died, his mother had passed, his uncles, all these people, he could not cry until he began to talk about a model airplane that he builds every year meticulously and then smashes because he made a promise that he would build an airplane. And so grief is, and grief, forgiveness, hope, all of those things are connected. And when you turn off our emotions, we turn a lot of those things off.
Thank you.
I would say that to speak about grief is it's probably one of the most important things that we do, and to tie that grief to all of what we hope for and what we don't get in the end, or what we lose. And I think that it's important to name what it is that we feel sad about. A lot of times it's hard for us to name it. And I was looking at one of the questions from I think it was Thomas Davis, and he talked about kind of the metaphysical with the heart being that representation of energy and all that stuff, and that our bodies express it. Well, I think if we don't acknowledge grief, our body has a way of acknowledging that we're grieving.
100%.
And this is a case in point for me, which was when my brother-in-law, when I got the news that my brother-in-law had died, and I felt deep sadness and emotion, and then, you know, it's my wife and the loss that she has, and this automatically disorientation of taking care of her to make sure that, you know, we get through this together. And so it was like it was almost as if I had to be present in a way for her, but to not be present for the grief that I needed to be for myself. But what I found was that weeks later, my knee had the worst pain ever. And it just, and I was trying to hold it all together. And I realized that grief was showing up in this physical pain that I was having in my knee. And it was like the worst pain ever. And it was like when I connected with that pain, I connected with the loss that I was experiencing with John.
Right. Grief takes its toll. Jonathan?
I've really enjoyed these stories, Caesar and Trey. Thank you for being a part of this. You've spoken into my own life. What I'm reflecting on is how, Nancy, you mentioned men, and how often anger is the safe emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the anger, it's really just grief underneath it. There's sadness. There's something that's been lost. And I'm struck at how adept I am at offering to my residents, offering to my peers and colleagues, a lot of grief or a lot of space for people to be angry. And I'll wonder what's under that anger, all those things I deliberate on, but it's really hard to do that with authorities, leadership. Mm-hmm. And I have so much respect and admiration for leadership during this time. It's been hard for me as a leader. And I know that probably on this chat, there's a whole lot of leaders out there. I know Caesar, you're a leader where you are, and Trey, I'm sure you are where you are. It's hard to be a leader and make decisions. And I wonder what's underneath the anger in not just my own space, but also underneath that in those around me.
Right. Thank you. You know, you guys have been really terrific, and it's clear that we've sparked a lot of interest and touched the questions of other folks. One person asked me to name a book that I'd referenced, so I'm going to hold it up. It's Military Moral Injury and Spiritual Care. You can find it referenced on our site, and it's yeah, but it has a number of chapters that are quite relevant for the conversation that we've had. It's intended precisely for care providers, and so I want to remind you that this will be available probably within the week here at this site and at the VOA YouTube. To remind you that these are monthly webinars. We have another one January 13th and again in February, so stay tuned. I thank you three especially for sharing.
If I can interrupt real quick. There was on the chat, there was someone who wondered how can we use, you know, best practices from the military who may have experienced this, and that's what that book is. So if that's what you're looking for, you will find it in that book. And also Carrie Doring's chapter in the book is applicable across contexts. It's not just, you know, it focuses on the military experience, but I think there's application in it from several chapters, but hers particularly.
I'll pass along your kudos to her.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much, and I hope that you stay safe and well in the days ahead. And thank you three for the work that you're doing on our behalf.
Thank you.
Best wishes, everyone. Hope we see you again soon.